Welcome to the Demystify Psi podcast. I'm your host, Anastasia.
I'm Michael Shiloh.
And today we are talking to Richard Hammerschlag about biofield therapies and acupuncture. And so our driving question is this. How is it that these therapies that are outside of the conventional practice window, so they're very different from normal medical interventions where you go to the doctor and you get a pill, how are these interventions actually helping people? And so in the process of this, we deal with, first of all, what these therapies actually encompass, the ways that they're tested, the clinical trials and how they're run, the way that they've gradually gotten to become more and more accepted in the academic and institutional realms. And we talk about all of the ways in which it's both difficult to test these and how much promise is found inside of integrated treatments that fall beyond what we would normally turn to when our bodies are out of whack.
And what does a culture that is capable of receiving the benefits of these practices look like? Because traditionally, these cultures are very different than the ones in the West. And so we examine some of the shamanic practices and the experiences that different peoples have and how we can imagine a culture for ourselves which is able to take advantage of things that aren't quite the lock and key idea of Western medicine.
And a huge thank you to Dr. Richard Hammerschlag for coming and talking to us, and also to our patron Todd Luger, who is the one who brought Dr. Hammerschlag to our attention.
Thanks, Todd.
A lot of our guests come exactly in this way, where somebody who listens is like, hey, you should check out this person. And we can't talk to everybody, obviously, but sometimes we find really interesting links because Dr. Hammerschlag actually worked on a paper with Michael Levin about the possibility of biofield therapies. And so, although they don't necessarily work together anymore right now, there's still this connection to the larger possibility of what this kind of research might down the road entail. And so we're super interested in it. We think that you will be as well. So we hope that you enjoy the conversation.
And let us know your ideas. Really, we keep lists of all of the people and the guests that you guys are suggesting in the comments on Discord, on Facebook. We're getting to them eventually, for sure. So talk to us and let us know. And let us know how we can do a better job at this. And if you like what we're doing, share it with somebody. Get out there. Maybe consider becoming a patron. If you become a patron, you can get involved in really orchestrating this and taking it into the next level. And ideally, we're moving towards a place where we can give grants to fund some of this research that doesn't fit inside of a traditional structure.
And also what we've started doing is in the description of the episodes, we've started including reading lists, which are a mixture of links to the things that we've talked about that are online, and also some affiliate links for books and other things that we've mentioned. So if you wanted to support the podcast and get a book, that is also an opportunity that is available to you.
Yeah, so thanks for joining us, and sit back, relax, and enjoy this conversation with Richard Hammerschlag.
The scientific revolution starts now.
The Demystify Psi podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
All right, let's start with saying people always want to know, does acupuncture work? And there's a real problem in just phrasing that question that way, because no one would ask, does pharmacology work? So if you start up here with biomedical research, pharmacology is one branch of that. So if you start up here with Chinese medicine, that's equivalent to biomedicine in terms of the level of scale. So just as pharmacology is one branch of biomedicine, acupuncture is one branch of a different medical system called, for lack of a better term, traditional Chinese medicine or Chinese traditional medicine. So acupuncture is not acupuncture any more than you would pool different kinds of drug studies together to see if pharmacology works. So when people want to even pool all the studies of acupuncture for, say, migraine, Well, there's different kinds of acupuncture, and migraine isn't migraine in Chinese medicine, so it can be due to different underlying imbalances. So you can't pool them together any more than you would pool drug studies for migraine, because there's different drugs are used for migraine, different drugs are used for blood pressure. So I would say it's an error of scale. So having said that, the other problem with acupuncture research is it was asked to be modeled, as most research is, on the way we do drug studies. So they want to know, how do you compare acupuncture to sham acupuncture? Well, what is sham acupuncture? The problem is, with a drug, we know in general how a drug acts. We know that how it's absorbed into the body, how well it's absorbed. Then we know, is it metabolized to something else, which is really the active substance? We know that it interacts with a receptor, causes changes. With acupuncture, let alone these biofield therapies, with acupuncture, we don't know how it works. So if you don't know how the real treatment works, you can't really create a sham or mock therapy. So
so with acupuncture, is there a series of principles that are used to teach the art that can be used as proxy for building a sham treatment? Because as far as I understand it, what you're doing is you're stimulating nerve centers with the insertion of needles.
well, there you go. I mean, we don't know how acupuncture works. We don't really know. I would not say that acupuncture can simply be mapped onto the nervous system. I mean, there's some indication that it is acting on sensory nerve endings, or that sensory nerve endings are being stimulated by whatever else the needle is acting on. We don't know. We don't know if once the needle is entering the body, acupuncture, so it's mostly an invasive, minimally invasive treatment. What is it acting on, and is a signal being generated? And if the signal is being generated, what carries the signal, and how is the signal received? We don't know any of these things. So when you do sham acupuncture, all you're mimicking is what the patient sees. So, for example, you know, in Shakespearean theater, or lots of dramatic theater, when they have a stage dagger, you know, so the blade actually retracts into the shaft, and it looks like it's entered. So they've created a tiny little acupuncture needle for the sham, where the tip is blunt, so that when it hits your skin, it retracts into the shaft. But the problem then is, you have to create a real needle that is the same look to it, because the patient is going to see what you're doing. And then the acupuncturists complain, because when they are doing true acupuncture in their clinic, they can sense the chi, if you like, through the needle. But when you have this larger, clunky needle, they can't have that same sensation, that same in touchness with the patient through the needle. So there's all kinds of problems of doing acupuncture as if it's a drug, not the least of which I would say is, so many of the studies of acupuncture research are really asking, is the needle effective, not is acupuncture effective? Because then we get into this whole thing of, in Chinese medicine and in Chinese martial arts, there's something, there's a big component of the treatment or the application of the martial arts of intention. It's called E. It's transliterated YI, but in Chinese medicine. And when I used to teach research at the Acupuncture College, I would try to ask the students to try to design a study to separate that. How do we determine if that E, that intention, is an important part of the treatment? And we never successfully isolated that part of the treatment to be able to look at it as a separate variable in the treatment.
Could you poke people in the wrong places?
Good. You absolutely could, and people do that, and so they either needle at correct acupuncture points but inappropriate to the treatment, or because they have these big maps that we've all seen in the clinics, you can try to needle in places that you think are not acupuncture points. So here's the problem. I kind of downplayed the idea that acupuncture is working through the nervous system. So is there any other idea being put forward of how acupuncture works? And the possibility is that it's acting through the fascia. So the fascia is a really hot topic these days in massage therapy, in many kinds of physical therapy. And the fascia is an amazingly beautiful system. There's who was he? A French hand surgeon. So it must be a good 10, 15 years ago, was starting to do a few of these heroic operations where an industrial accident happens and a finger is severed, or the whole hand is severed, and it's quickly put in ice, and he's given the heroic task of trying to stitch the hand back on.
Is this Jean-Claude Jamberteau?
Exactly, Wimberto, yes. So if you've ever seen those videos, they are just beautiful, that he got permission from a few patients and worked with an engineering colleague and made these basically videos of what the living fascia looks like.
Strolling under the skin, I think.
Strolling under the skin, yes. There's a few small segments of it now on YouTube. If anyone wants to have a look at it, they're just beautiful. And he on strolling under the skin. What do they call it in French? Promenade sous la peau. And so when you get the video, you can get an English or a French soundtrack to it. So the English track is set to Strauss waltzes to make it. It's really beautiful, but it is quite lovely. And one of the first acupuncture books that was ever written to popularize acupuncture in the early 80s was Ted Kaptchuk's book, which was called The Web That Has No Weaver. And if you look at this, the fascia, it looks really like you could call it the web that has no weaver, because this beautiful three-dimensional structure, which has been referred to as, to use the Buckminster Fuller term, tensegrity. It's a tensegritous structure, meaning it retains its structure under tension, retains its integrity under tension. So, and you see how it moves and twists, but the rest of the structure comes to the rescue. So you don't see any breaks in the structure in the video, despite all its movement.
Yeah, there's these beautiful shots in the film where you have this network of collagen and it's a web. And what you see that there's these strings of collagen as the two layers of, I guess, of skin and of muscle move relative to one another.
Yes.
The web maintains as the individual strands are flowing across these nodes and disappearing and then emerging on the other side. It's this really, it's a really weird ability for the objects, these filaments of collagen, to maintain their structure even as they pass through one another.
Yes. So these strands are collagen, and collagen, as you probably know, is a triple helix. So it's not like our double. So if you've done any nautical stuff, you see how these ropes, a triple helix is really strong, and so it's these collagen fibers make up the fascia, and it's this what's called superficial fascia. So it's just right under the skin. So there's some evidence that what we know of traditionally as acupuncture meridians seem to follow the connective tissue lines, the planes of the connective tissue. There's some beginning evidence. The woman who did that, Hélène Langevin, is an MD and also an acupuncturist, and she's now, as you may know, she's now the director of the part of the NIH, the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health, that oversees all of this research into all the interventions that are not strictly come under the biomedical umbrella. So it's wonderful to have somebody who's the director who has finally, it's the first time they've had a director of this part of the NIH who comes from a practice that this office oversees. Well, it's not an office, it's a center. It was originally created as an office within NIH, and then Congress moved it up and funded it as a center. So it's not yet an institute, but it's this middle level entity. So,
is there any sense of mechanism there?
Yes.
Like how,
okay. Right. Sorry, we got off on this.
No. I'm very interested. You got to understand the fascia thing is really important to us too. It's something we've been absolutely obsessed with. One of our good friends thinks that he literally thinks that there's nothing else in medicine that matters. He's like, cancer, diabetes, everything, it's fascia.
Terrific.
And so, and we've had a lot of experience too with our own bodies. Like we do a lot of rock climbing, and he got us into all these different fascial manipulation techniques, and they seem to have helped a lot. I mean, it could be placebo, but
sure.
Yeah, so it's really, really
the original
cool
ideas of fascia was, to when you have a painful stiff shoulder, so the whole body readjusts and it knows that and that happens through the fascia. And when you get massage or some kind of physical therapy and it starts to heal, then the rest of the body doesn't have to take up the slack anymore. So that happens through the fascia. But here's the thing: why go through all of the millions of years of evolution to create this whole body network? I mean, that's the amazing thing about the fascia. It's from the toe up to the brain. It's one continuous network. How about if this network is also an information carrying system? I mean, that's really the exciting possibility to me. So that think of a spider web, which again is this beautiful. Well, we can think of a spider web more in 2 dimensions, but a little bit of it is in 3 dimensions too. So if a fly comes and it lands on a node, a connection of 2 or 3 or multiple strands, you get a pretty strong vibration. But if you get 2 or 3 flies that land on single strands, you can have a cumulative vibration. So the spider, finds its lunch. But if acupuncture points are the nodes of the fascia, okay, you get a pretty strong signal. But the problem is, in designing acupuncture studies to mimic real world acupuncture, you very rarely get treated with one acupuncture needle. So you wouldn't have just one, so then you'd have one sham needle. But most of the time in a treatment, you get multiple needles. And so a real sham should have multiple needles in, as you said before, Shiloh, in the wrong places. Okay. But if you look at it's really difficult to put a needle anywhere that's not going to find some strand of the fascia. And so perhaps when you get 3, 4, 5 needles in, and even if they're missing the nodes, they're hitting single strands, you can get a cumulative effect. And this is why it's always been difficult to see a large difference between real acupuncture, what we call verum acupuncture, and sham acupuncture, because you're using a large number of needles to mimic. Because we always, when we're designing studies with acupuncture, we're always faced with a kind of dual challenge. You want the design to be robust enough to be acceptable to to biomedical. You want physicians to refer to acupuncture, and you want acupuncture to be accepted into mainstream medicine. But you also want to have respect for the tradition from which it comes. So you have to balance the design to really be testing acupuncture and not just be testing the needle.
And
so,
in terms of the mechanism for is it just the idea that perhaps you're stimulating these and we don't understand the sensory depth of this physical system, so we don't understand the mechanism by which the stimulation loosens things or changes whatever it's changing in the end, right? I mean, acupuncture can be, or it's often, well, maybe you can just tell us, it's used for all sorts of things, right? It's not just for bodily aches and pains,
absolutely,
but for
it is
guts
a complete,
and heart
medicine. Yes. So you hit on another of my pet peeves, and that's using the word mechanism. Almost all the studies that are of interest with acupuncture are getting correlations. You needle certain points and you measure changes in the immune system. You measure changes in natural killer cells or in cytokines. These are really important immune system markers. But like I said before, a mechanism means we know all the steps between putting that needle in and getting to the point where that immune system marker is increased or decreased. Okay, so even with changes in the endorphins, which really put acupuncture on the biomedical map for the first time, when they could actually suggest that acupuncture analgesia works through the endorphin system. Again, that's just correlations. We don't know what the mechanism, just talk about mechanism, how acupuncture relieves pain. We know that's downstream. I could tell you a really interesting related story, that there's one day I think there's going to be a Nobel Prize for placebo research. Because we're really getting to the point of seeing that placebo has real physiological correlates again. And one of the people who's done the most research on this is an Italian whose name is Fabrizio Benedetti. It's a wonderful Italian name. And I was at a conference way back in the 90s when he presented some of his first findings that you could increase the placebo response or decrease the placebo response under experimental conditions by pre-treating. They got permission to do this in humans by manipulating the endorphin system, by giving pharmaceutical agents that stimulate the endorphin system or that block it, and you could increase or decrease. And people got extremely excited, and there were lots of praise in the question period for finally getting the most robust evidence to date that the placebo seemed to act through the endorphin system. And he looked at the person, he said, this is really minor. He said, if you want to really understand how the placebo is working, we have to grab the gold ring to understand how meaning is converted to physiology.
The gold ring. So Fabrizio Benedetti said that the gold ring of placebo science was to understand how to convert meaning into physiology.
Yes, that was his phrase, meaning into physiology. I don't think the gold ring was his phrase, but that was the implication. That was the implication. And when you do a clinical trial, say with a drug, you must in the informed consent that all the patients sign, you have to reveal that they might get the placebo or the real drug, and whether it's 50-50 or 1/3 of the time you could get the placebo and sometimes 2/3 the drug, but whatever, you have to reveal it, and you also have to reveal what the potential side effects are of the drug. Okay, and so it's amazing the amount of literature that's now built up of the kinds of side effects that people generate who are on the placebo just because they've read that they're going to have them. I mean, there was one study from Japan which was doing a chemotherapeutic new drug, and the people on the placebo were actually experiencing hair loss.
Whoa.
So it's not just, anxiety or a slight stomach disorder or a slight dizziness, but it's serious symptoms that people are generating because they've converted meaning to physiology. This is all I can say, and that is fascinating. And when I was making some notes for our talk, thinking about what to say, I sort of realized that it can work both ways, because we also have no way of explaining with pain. With pain, what we're doing is converting physiology to meaning. You're getting some kind of physical change to the damaged organ, is recognizing that there's damage, and so a pain signal is going up to the brain. And how do we recognize that signal as harmful, as pain? We don't know, and that gets us into this whole wonderful juicy area that would be more fun to have a beer and to talk about, is the whole mind brain dilemma, and what is consciousness, and how do we, in this case, how do we reconcile the subjective and the objective is what it is. That's what is called the hard question in consciousness, is how do we what is blueness? We've got all these, the medical imaging is now so far advanced that we're getting more and more sophisticated correlates, again, of subjective experience, whether it's meditative states or psychedelics or all kinds of behavioral change. We know with more and more sophistication what's happening in the brain, but we don't know what's the link between the EEG or the functional MRI traces and the subjective experience. We don't know how to mesh those two.
Well, I think go ahead.
So I was going to say, I feel like we have come a long way, though. I was a neuroscience major in college like 15 years ago or something. And I remember just starting to look at the immune system and realizing how similar the neurons were to the immune cells.
Yes.
And I remember thinking, like, this is going to be a huge field one day. These guys are talking to one another, and there's a conversation that's happening. And the details of that, I didn't even know the language to even begin to examine them. But I feel like this is becoming a pretty mainstream conception at this point.
Yes.
And it's certainly on the road to understanding how, especially human beings, especially have this bizarre ability to control their physiology. I mean, it's really remarkable. I mean, even just the breath hold is a great example. But you can hold your breath until you pass out. Basically, that's wild. And then it just goes on and on from there. When you're real run down and bummed out about the world, you start getting a cold all of a sudden. It's just uncanny, right?
Yes.
But it seems like there is a road. I hate to bring up your favorite or your least favorite word, but it seems like there is a road to mechanism there. like there seems to be a road.
Because there must be a mechanism.
But so we can look at it backwards, and once we know that there's a change in the immune system from acupuncture, so that's the end of the line. So what's the step before that? We can work our way back upstream. So it's not. There isn't a total black box. We can work at mechanism from both ends. Mm-hmm. What is the acupuncture needle doing? And how does that, if there is a change in that immune system marker, then something caused that change proximally to the change. What triggered the cells to release the cytokines?
Is there a difference between the types of materials that are used for acupuncture needles? Like if you use a plastic needle, do you get the same effects as if you use a conducting needle?
That's a really good question, and you have to really talk to some acupuncturists to get that. I know that there are all different kinds, and it was a particular problem in research when they were doing functional MRI with acupuncture, because you can't use needles that are magnetic in a magnetic field. So they were using they will use various types of non-magnetic needles. But I wanted to jump back a bit to what Shiloh said before, because way back, I don't have to tell you how many decades ago I was getting my PhD, but I was in a brand new area of my PhD work called Neuroendocrinology, which was the first recognition that the nervous system and the endocrine system were talking to each other, and both ways, that the nervous system could influence the endocrine system, and more importantly, that it worked the other way. I mean, there were 3 landmark papers in the New England Journal of Medicine in the mid 60s that really set out for the first time the area of neuroendocrinology, and it was because they were finding the same kind of communication molecules, these peptides that would be released, and the receptors for these were on both nerve cells and endocrine cells. And again, so then the next step was the immune system was part of the game. And so we still have the problem that in medical school and in universities, you still have an immunology department and a endocrinology department and a neuro department. And I was fortunate enough for my first professional job, when I first set up my own lab, it was in the second neurosciences department in the country at that time. The first was at Harvard, and the second one was in Southern California, where I was fortunate enough to join. The idea was, if you want to understand the nervous system, you had to have a physiologist and a psychologist and an anatomist and a chemist and all the different disciplines working together. So it was very, very exciting times. It was also right after Sputnik went up, and so there was all kinds of grant money was available for basic sciences in those days. It was very, very exciting times. The genetic code was just being broken in the 60s when I was a graduate student, and exciting times. And
Can you tell us a little bit more about the path that you took from pretty conventional neuroendocrinology studies to becoming dean of the Pacific College of Oriental Medicine?
Well, it wasn't at the Pacific College, but it was at Oregon.
Sorry, at the Oregon College. That's
Yeah,
my bad.
yeah. Where to start? I guess first I should tell you that I'm a Gemini, and so I've always been very comfortable, and I always loved having, in this case, one foot in Western medicine and another foot in Eastern medicine, or we could call it Eastern medicine, or Chinese and Japanese, Korean, Thai. It's all that traditional type of medicine. And so how did I get interested? There were, well, first from biochemistry, I went into neurobiology. I had a sister who just shy of her 19th birthday died of a brain tumor, and I always wanted to understand more of basic sciences of neuro. And then one of my first summer jobs was at a paint company in Brooklyn, New York, and the guy who I got friendly with there told me that it's too bad I would working the whole summer there, because he always took a week off and went up into the Adirondacks canoeing, and I could come with him. So I resigned a week early and went off to the Adirondacks. And when we were in this general store getting supplies for the canoe trip, they had a huge cardboard box with secondhand paperbacks. And there was a book by an author named Paul de Kruif, who's mainly remembered by having written this book called Microbe Hunters, where he talked about the first microscopes and the first use of hand washing, wherever so he highlighted, but he himself, Paul de Kruif, had a nervous breakdown and was hospitalized, and wrote about the whole experience. And it was at a time when they were first using antidepressants. There were wolfia alkaloids, reserpine, and people were awakening. There was that movie that was made based on these books, Awakenings, and I just got fascinated again between that link between biochemistry and behavior, and what was neural activity telling us. So I had this fairly long career of 25 years doing basic neurobiology. I was studying mainly how proteins got to where they were going. It's a problem in any kind of cell in the body, but particularly in nerve cells, which are the longest cells in the body. A sensory neuron has its cell body just outside of the spinal cord. A motor neuron has its cell body in the spinal cord, but from the spinal cord all the way down to the toe is one long cell. And how does the cell maintain itself, this long axon? And there's a process called axonal transport, and there's a kind of molecular zip code basically. So when the protein is synthesized, there's a portion of it that's not going to function in a particular way, but it's in a kind of a molecular zip code, an address molecule marker, so that all of the proteins with that same address marker get put into a little packet, a vesicle, and that gets put onto basically a railroad track system, and people now know what that motor molecule is that ratchets the vesicles along the microtubules in the long axon of the neuron. And the vesicles themselves have a marker, so some of them will get off the railroad track along the way to replenish the materials and the proteins particular along the way. Some of them go all the way to the end and replenish the molecules at the synapse. Some of them are involved in actual nerve function, and those molecules will make the transmitters that get released as the signaling process. So I studied all of that, and for a number of other reasons at that time, I was interested in martial arts, and I wound up studying Tai Chi. I started with some others that didn't take, and then I walked into a Tai Chi studio, and my body said yes. And within a month or so of starting Tai Chi, I was practicing outside my home, and there's a kind of kick. This is my hand, but there's a kind of kick, and I felt a pain going down my leg, and I thought I'd better slow up. And the next time that kick came around, the pain shot all the way down my leg, and I had to call friends literally to carry me back into my home. And when I could walk, I went to a neurologist and to an orthopedic surgeon, and in those days the only imaging was X-rays, and it became pretty clear that I had developed an acute sciatica condition, which was ironic because for all of those years I was studying this flow of proteins in the longest nerve cells I could find as a laboratory model, which was the sciatic nerve of bullfrogs. So this was the revenge of the bullfrogs, that I would get laid low with the sciatica condition. But what happened was one of the advanced students who had been assigned to me in the Tai Chi class called, and she said, where have you been? You were progressing pretty well. And I told her what had happened, and she laughed and she said, "Okay, Mr. Western Scientist, it's time for acupuncture." And I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Well, my acupuncturist treats sciatica, and you've been to you've been to Western medicine." And what I told her was that they said, "Well, it doesn't show up on the X-ray, which means it's not a spinal problem, and it's probably the buttocks muscle spasms presses on that nerve, and you get this radiating pain down your leg." And all they wanted to do was know what kind of pain meds I wanted to suppress the pain. And I kept saying, "I don't want to suppress the pain. I want to know what the problem is." And they would say, "Well, it doesn't show up in the X-ray. It's a soft tissue problem. We can't help you." So then I get this phone call, and she comes and picks me up and takes me to her acupuncturist. And I get one treatment, and I can get off the table. And I said, "Oh my gosh, what's going on here?" And I later find out that they know where to put the needle to get that buttocks muscle to relax and get the pressure off. And then they give you herbs to strengthen the underlying imbalance. So if you're stressed again, it doesn't trigger that spasm again. So I was living at the time fairly close to the UCLA Biomedical Library. And I said, I got to find out what's going on here. And I would spend a half a day or so, sometimes a full day, in the biomedical library reading about what was known about acupuncture and quote how it worked, what the mechanism was, because that was my Western mindset. And very shortly after that, the first, this was the mid to late 1970s, the first evidence came partly from Beijing and partly from the University of Toronto, two different research labs, showing the involvement of the endorphins in acupuncture analgesia. So Gemini that I got fascinated with how to explain East and West. So as I was healing from the sciatica, not only doing Tai Chi, but I got involved in the running craze. So I was first jogging to strengthen my legs. And I got a very good massage therapist to help me with the running, and also strengthening my buttocks muscles and everything, keeping me loosened up. And one day she said to me, I have these two Chinese brothers in my practice, and they're just starting an acupuncture college. They would be very interested in talking to you because they need people to teach the preclinical sciences in addition to the acupuncture. So I thought, well, that would be interesting. And I had lunch with them, and they said, Western scientist, how'd you get interested in acupuncture? And I told them about my experience, which was about 10 years earlier by that time. And they started laughing. And I said, wait a minute, and they said right away, no, we're not laughing at you, but we think that person who gave you that treatment was our father. Mm-hmm. And so I'm on some kind of path here. And it turned out that was the case. He had trained them in acupuncture, and there was a long family tradition, and they were starting an acupuncture college named after their grandfather, which was called Yosan University, was in Santa Monica, and they needed people to teach the preclinical. And I said, well, this is pretty amazing to have this opportunity, but I don't know anything about the curriculum. And so they took out their brochures and showed me. And, in retrospect, it's obvious that students have to learn Western pharmacology because they have to know about herb-drug interactions, and they need to know at least a lot of surface anatomy, because part of how you locate the acupuncture points now are based on a lot of surface anatomy. And I said, this is quite amazing that students can learn two medicines that are entirely different in terms of how they see the body. Western medicine is all about isolated things, isolated systems, and isolated organs, and isolated molecules, and Chinese medicine is all about flow and balance, and it's a very different system. And Western medicine doesn't know what meridians are, let alone acupuncture points. And I thought this would be a great challenge. And I said, I don't want to teach biology or physiology to these students, because these are students who've chosen a different medicine, and you have to find someone else who's going to teach that. What I'd like to do is create a course that looks at how we talk about these two medicines together, basically, because someday what we really want is a medicine that combines the best of both. I mean, Chinese medicine is wonderful at detecting early symptoms before early imbalances, they would say, before they become Western signs and symptoms. And if you jump out of a plane and your parachute doesn't open and you crash land, you don't want acupuncture. That's where you want acute care from Western medicine. So those are just two extremes. But we want not only cross referrals, but we want eventually a real integrative medicine. So. Gosh, where was I? I'll get off.
I wanted to I have one question.
Yeah,
I'm curious if it seems like your experience was very natural, opening into realizing there's this whole other world out there. Like, you didn't have one jarring experience where you realized that Western medicine wasn't going to cut it alone. maybe that moment when the doctor tried to give you pain medicine or something, but it seems like at each step you were. What was your mindset going into that acupuncture? Would you consider yourself a skeptic? Were you very like hesitant about it, or were you kind of open to the idea that it actually might work for you?
Why was I open? I was definitely open. Um, for example, when when I was given the herbs for the first time, it was the 1970s, and there weren't a lot of powders and granules and pills. It was just the raw herbs in those days. And I took the raw herbs out to my lab because in any kind of biochemistry lab, you have what's called a fume hood, where when you have to mix to not if you have to distill reagents that have a strong smell or have
Volatile?
that are volatile, and you don't want those smells in the lab. So it's under a kind of
Positive
vacuum,
pressure, right?
and there's a very large, thick glass plate that you can pull down while you're distilling your reagents under that hood. And I thought this would be a really good place because I knew the herbs had a strong smell. So I would brew them in my lab, and I got a lot of flack from my colleagues who wanted to know what was I doing there. And I started to explain them to them, and they would say to me, "Oh, you don't really believe in acupuncture." And I would say, "It's not a belief system. You don't really have to believe in acupuncture to make it work any more than you have to believe in Western medicine for it to work. It doesn't hurt to believe in it, but on the other hand, we need to test acupuncture like we test any intervention, to really test it by Western standards." And this is what gave me the idea that someday I would see if I could get into acupuncture research. So I was open, very open to the idea. Why was I open? There was a part of me that was always drawn to other ways of how the body could work. I remember finding a book when I was in high school. The book was called Concentration. Again, I found it in a used bookstore, and it was written by a Hindu sadhu, sort of explaining a lot of Ayurvedic traditions to Westerners. And there was one study there. He said, take a sewing needle and put butter on it, and so that it can just float on top of a teacup full of water. So you take the knitting needle and butter and put it there. And he said, practice and practice and practice, and you can make that needle move away from you, towards you. And I did, and I spent a lot of time. And not only was I able to make the needle move, but I could sense when it was going to work. And I thought, wow, there's something really interesting going on here. So that was just one way that I was open. A whole another long story involved my undergraduate thesis that I wound up doing a thesis on comparing the hallucinogenic cactus to the hallucinogenic mushroom. And the story had just broken then about a banker on the east side of New York who had, through a whole story that I won't go into, but had just gotten back from Mexico and found an extant, still existing, but way in the villages above Oaxaca, in the hallucinogenic mushroom was still being used, and had just gotten permission from the indigenous people to take a batch back with him, which he sent to Albert Hofmann, the chemist in Switzerland who had isolated LSD. And I he had written up his whole experience in none other than Life magazine, because that's a whole nother story, which we won't get into. But when I started to do this thesis, I was comparing just the visions under peyote of Anglos to native people, to to the indigenous people, how their visions differed. And I was also interested in, since the peyote is not just the mescaline, it's a whole lot of alkaloids, how much of the ritual around the peyote came out of tribal ceremony and traditional ways, and how much actually came out of was based on the alkaloids. For example, there's an emetic, a very strong emetic in many of these. We now call them entheogens.
They make you barf.
The what?
They make you barf.
They make you barf. Yes. And so what the people say is it's it's a cleansing before the gods can enter you. That's a really nice part of the ceremony. And there was other types of alkaloids that were similar. And then the third part of my thesis was going to be to try to extract from the literature at that time what was known about the biochemistry of hallucinations. Very little was known, and then the news broke about this banker who, with his Russian wife, had gone into Mexico and found this mushroom ceremony. And although there was no evidence that the desert people of the cactus and the high mountain people of the mushroom had ever interacted, a lot of the ceremony was similar. Certainly the cleansing of the body before the god can enter and other aspects were similar. So I wrote to the guy in New York, and he said, well, rather than a conversation, a phone or letters, some other people are coming down to my home. If you can come down to New York, you're welcome to join us. So I thought, okay, this sounds great. And I showed up at his house, and he met me at the door, and he said I'd come on a very auspicious evening. He said, he told me he had sent to Switzerland and to Hoffman, and Hoffman had finally believed that he had isolated psilocybin for the first time and sent the psilocybin to Gordon Wasson, was his name. And that evening, he and these other people at his house were going to take this isolated psilocybin for the first time to see how well it mimicked. This would have been about 1966 or 67, something like that. How well, no, earlier than that. It would have been 61 or 2. Anyway, he said, well, you're here tonight. Do you want to observe or do you want to take part? And his daughter was a nurse at Mount Sinai, and she was engaged to an intern there, and they were going to be our medical support team, to see if our pupils were dilating or to take our pulse or Lord knows what they were going to do. So I took a deep breath and I said, I'm in. And that was my first experience with in those days, they were called psychotomimetics, mimics, things like that. We didn't use the term entheogens, or they were called hallucinogens. And that was my first experience, and I could get firsthand about what I was writing about, which was quite fascinating and important to me. And a year later, I was starting graduate school and starting to get into neurobiology, and I had one last summer, and I had my longest term friend was also, I was starting graduate school in the Boston area, and he was starting at Stanford, and we didn't have enough money to go to Europe, and we said, let's spend our 6 weeks together in Mexico. So we met in Laredo, Texas, and we got on a bus and we went down to Mexico, and we had our 4 or 5 weeks. And towards the end of our trip, I said to my friend Bill, I said, we've been trying to, in our travels through Mexico, to engage as much as possible rather than just be tourists. I mean, we wound up being able to take a highlight lesson in addition to just watching the highlight. So we found ourselves taking a lesson, and we got out to the university and we got into a soccer match rather than just watching a pickup game with the students. So I said, here we are near Oaxaca, and I started telling my friend this whole story of what I had been through about my thesis. And I said, let's take our last week here and see if we can find the village ourselves. Because when Wasson had written it up for Life magazine, he had changed the name of the village and changed the name of his contact at the village. Anyway, very long, amazing story short, we found our way to the village, and we
Is this San Jose del Pacifico?
Excuse me?
Is this San Jose del Pacifico?
No, it was Huautla de Jimenez was the name of the village, and it was the village where the curandera was the subsequent unfortunate woman named Maria Sabina, because she was too open. She wanted Westerners to be able to have the same experience and understanding as the local people, and too many Westerners started coming, and the village got really angry, furious with her, and they wound up burning her hut. It was a very unfortunate, that was years after we were there, but we managed to find our way, and we found our way to her because on the way to there, we met another guy who was the Midwest regional circulation manager for Time Life. So he had also seen the article that came in Life magazine, and he had written to Wasson, and Wasson had sent him a letter of introduction to the local school teacher who was the link between many of the Westerners and Maria Sabino. And she spoke Spanish as well as, I believe the language was Mixtec. And so we linked up with him and wound up being able to take part. We didn't want a ceremony just for us. We wanted to be part of an ongoing ceremony. And so without going into a lot of details, once you've had these kind of experiences, it opens you up to other ways of knowing, other kinds of reality. It puts you on a parallel track to whatever your other track is. And so later, when I was open to acupuncture, it was no problem trying to understand other ways that the body worked, other ways that you could affect health. And so
it seems like there's two different types of people. It seems like there's the people who have the interest to be open to such experiences.
I believe it's a personality trait.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's like one of the big 5 personality traits. And so there's some people who are open, and there are some people that aren't interested. And I wonder how deeply that correlates to the efficacy of something like acupuncture or biofield therapy, not even in the sense of a placebo effect necessarily, because the placebo effect, I think, happens. The weirdest thing about the placebo effect is that it works even if you know that you're taking a placebo.
Yes, the so-called open placebo.
And so there must be layers here where you have the open placebo effect, and then you have the deeper placebo effect, which is innate to the people who are open to the experience and to open to being changed by the experience.
Yeah. We should explain just a little more in case people don't know what the open placebo means. It's they've done studies where they tell people you are getting a placebo, and it still gives you a so-called placebo effect.
There was a guy I follow on Twitter who I think his name's Nick Camarata. I've been trying to get him on the show, but he made this point where he had bought a box of sugar pills that were marketed as open placebo pills to fix all ailments. And he's like, I don't understand anybody who's not doing this, because you can be having a bad day and you can take one of these, and even if you know it's not going to work, it will work. To some degree, for some small number of mood
variations. That's right. For some people, that's right. Nothing works. I mean, no real treatment works for everybody, for every condition. So,
yeah, of course.
And we know the whole history of snake oil treatments and in the Wild West and all of this. So
yeah, I think that's why it's so hard. Yeah, I think that's what makes this so tricky and so difficult, because no science, no medical treatment works in a vacuum. And so you do have this history of charlatans and snake oil salesmen. And so the way that we've dealt with that is we've created evidence-based medicine, where you have control groups and you have studies and you have mechanism and you have all of these tools that are used to prevent the exploitations of people's deepest hopes and fears. Because what is more important to any of us than health? What is more important than waking up and knowing that your body will always work and do the things that you want it to do? Nothing. Yes. And it is the place where you can exploit people's spirit to the greatest degree. And so there's all of these structures that we've put into place to make sure that that doesn't happen. And so when you start to explore something that operates in this weird gray area where it seems like it works, and you have many anecdotes of people saying that it works, and then you try to apply these very strict rules to it. And this is kind of where we opened the conversation, where there's things that change from moment to moment. Your practitioners are not people that you can put into a machine and see how much curing power they have at any given moment.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so you're in this terribly difficult position of trying to fit a practice that is, by its very nature, squishy into a structure that has been erected to do away with anything squishy.
Yes. So two big, I mean, there's so many things we could talk about, but the two big things from what you said is we should have a policy at NIH, which is never going to happen, that a certain percentage of drug research that's NIH funds, a certain percentage of that should go into funding placebo research. Because the more the placebo works, hopefully the less drug you have to take. And ultimately, we all should learn ourselves, as well as to have physicians trained in how to maximize that placebo response. But the other thing that it's engendered is skeptics with a capital S. We all obviously should be skeptical. So the good part of evidence-based medicine is it tells us that there are put in place guidelines for looking at the research to make sure that it really is working. Okay, but the capital S skeptics are people who, for instance, like with homeopathy, they just don't want to know the research. They don't want to know the facts, because to them it can't work, because once you dilute a molecule past Avogadro's number, there is, quote, nothing there, period. And so they, it's either, how can we say it? They have to either believe something that they know doesn't work, or they have to disbelieve the scientific method. If what I'm saying is, when you look at studies that have been done on homeopathy and other types of interventions that they, quote, know can't work. Okay. So that means they have to either pick apart the research design, or they have to accept something that they can't accept because it doesn't fit their way of looking at the world. So they're stuck between, a rock and a hard place, basically, for something like homeopathy. So it's like, holding a cross in the old days against
Against
against the
vampires.
witches,
Yeah.
or and it's really tough. And so that's the upside and the downside to evidence-based medicine. And a lot of these other types of interventions, like acupuncture and herbal medicine, were developed with what I guess we have to call experience-based medicine, because given enough time, you look at what herbs work, and you look at, you see an animal that has injured itself and it's bleeding, and it goes and rolls around in a certain field. And then you go and you see what are the plants, what are the herbs that are growing in that field, and you try them. And you see, when does it work, and and for what conditions does it work? And the ancient herbalists, they were amazing experimentalists in their own way. They had amazing powers of observation and understanding, and we have to call that experience-based medicine. And so much of what we use that's come into pharmacology had its origins in this other way of testing.
Is there something inherent to these cultures that allows the people to be open to these experiences in a way that makes them more effective? Because you mentioned something about your college thesis where you were like, indigenous people undergoing these hallucinogenic ceremonies have very different visions than Westerners. And I was hoping that you could speak more about that, because I wonder if the cultural conditioning doesn't lend itself towards efficacy in a way that makes it very difficult here in the West. And I really want to get into what is the mindset of is there a cohesion to the vision in these indigenous cultures that we don't have here, or what, is it just different, or?
I mean, the mindset is that there's no skepticism about whether the skepticism we have as to whether a Western medicine is going to work or not doesn't exist to the same extent in indigenous culture. It's part of how they relate to the natural world, that the plants speak to them, the plants help them, the plants will guide them as to which plants they should use. This is part of as I understand it, a curandera training. And we have enough books of firsthand accounts of curanderas who tell this to us. What have I read recently? There's an Australian woman,
Monica Gagliano.
Excuse me?
Monica Gagliano?
Monica Gagliano. If you could get her on, she is wonderful. And she has a recent book called Thus Speak the Plants. And she has had these remarkable experiences of the plants not only telling her what to use for herself, but helping her design the kinds of research that she should do. Fellowship of River.
She's been doing really, really incredible work on plant cognition and awareness and communication. That's just the book is excellent, because she has these experiments described within it that, as you say, are informed by the plants that are in the experiments, but that seem to really suggest an active ability to sense and respond and communicate that is beyond what anyone in what I would say consensus research would agree to. But the results that she's getting are really astounding.
They get left out of the consciousness discussion almost 100% of the time. It's really fascinating. We talk to consciousness scientists all the time.
She describes meetings of people who are doing this kind of research with plants. So they're getting to hopefully a critical mass of people, and that if people don't, if there are mainstream people who don't want to believe it, let them not believe it. Let them not accept it. I mean, we do. She publishes her research designs. Other people are free to try to reproduce them, and they're doing that.
I think that when you go down that road, though, you end up in a position where you really have to start changing your relationship to the entire universe. And I think that that's a pretty hard thing to do.
That's what I'm kind of trying to get at with these hallucinogenic ceremonies, is understanding what the indigenous people are keying into, like what their visions look like that we don't tend to experience. Like a lot of kids in this country, their first hallucinogenic experience is going to be at a party after they've had 5 beers and they're trying to impress somebody on the other side of the room. Like it's a bit, I'm really trying to understand.
It's a very specific example.
Yeah. But if I guess, I mean, I'm kind of leading the witness here, but I'm trying to understand what sort of mentality is being celebrated in these mythological primings.
Let's make a big jump here, because this is what I really think a lot about lately, is our whole what we're facing with climate change has so much to do with our loss of interconnection. And part of that interconnection is with the plant world, with the animals, with each other. Indigenous people used to be able to contact each other. I think we have to begin to believe this over vast distances. Australian Aborigines, native peoples in the Amazon, we read about, had these abilities, and now we use the internet, and we've lost the direct ability, and our loss of our going down this awful path with climate has to do with our relationship to nature that we have totally lost, and we think we can dominate it and control it and use it as a commodity, and we don't have these conversations. We're not open to that anymore. That is part of the problem. And I do think that the real value of, and let's call them, the idea of calling them entheogens, is getting away from, so anyone who refers to them as an entheogen is not using them for recreational purposes. They're using them for expanding their view of reality, for reconnecting to nature. And once you've had this experience of this reconnection, of this oneness that is this another kind of web that has no weaver, as we were talking about before, it opens you up to other ways of seeing, other ways of knowing.
Well, it can, right? But it can also land you in a loony bin, right? There's that's the thing about the West. If you talk to people that I know, I have friends who absolutely hate psychedelic experiences. The whole idea of it drives them up a wall, because they're like, that stuff makes me feel paranoid and worried and take in all of this. They're not coming at it from an approach of meeting the cosmos, right? They're actually just getting into this place where they're staring at this hall of mirrors, and they're locked in this, they're just, oh my God, I'm such a mess in my life and all this, right?
Yeah. There's a really funny moment in Curb Your Enthusiasm where Larry David smokes weed for the first time. And he goes into a bathroom and he has an existential crisis staring at himself in the mirror, because he's such a jerk. He's like one of the worst people possible. And he has this brief moment where he cracks open the book of who he is, and then you can see him just slam it shut as quickly as possible.
Yeah, and I wonder if there's something about that mythology and those ceremonies that primes you to open yourself. Because the decision to open, like if you go into a psychedelic experience and you don't have this intention of I'm going to meet the cosmos and align myself to it, but instead you say, I'm going to stand myself, I'm going to be strong against the cosmos.
Yes.
That's kind of where things could end up kind of ugly for you. And I feel like those indigenous cultures must get that. And it's just baked into
It's a whole spectrum of responses. And, we can't forget the biochemistry. It's up to your liver to detoxify the substance. And if your liver enzymes aren't working very well, you have a certain psychic ability to deal with the experience. And after a bit, I can't do it anymore. I've reached my limit, and the liver says, I'm sorry, I can't detoxify the drug fast enough to meet where your limit is. And that's when the bad trip starts to happen. And it's this, we always talk about set and setting. That's so critical to us, especially now that we're into psychedelic assisted therapy, that the person who is your guide has to go through very serious training. I live partly in Oregon, and I'm following very closely the new law that's passed in Oregon, and the stringency of the training that the guides have to go through before they are licensed to have this function. And so many of the early studies at places like Johns Hopkins did value that setting and having at least one and sometimes two trained people who gave you that solidity of that other reality, so that you didn't get lost. You didn't have hopefully a bad trip. But there's always going to be, unfortunately, some people who have, it's a combination of their psyche and their liver that are going to be, it's not something to do lightly. But
I feel like even just hearing if you had a narrative going into it, instead of believing that you're going to experience paranoia, you had the belief that you're going to meet this serpent demon, right? Yes. And everybody's like, yo, you're going to see this serpent demon, and he's going to show you some stuff that he's going to try to scare you. And you had this mentality where it was this shared experience that was surmountable at the same time. But don't worry, hold on, listen to what the demon says, and you will be able to see the chinks in his armor. Kinks in his armor? Chinks in his armor. You'll be able to slip through there somehow, right? And so there's this narrative of how you pass through that embedded in the mythology.
But I think that also comes from maybe being part of a culture where you have the right to change. And we live in a time where if I can speak in broad strokes, most people are pretty locked into the world that they live in. It's hard to change your job. It is hard to change your life. It is really threatening if you have a family and you have some kind of experience where suddenly you realize that what you're doing doesn't fit for you anymore, or your parents expect something of you, and so you have to live a certain way. And to experience that kind of awakening in a culture that doesn't give you the space to be able to make a radical shift,
that's right,
is terrifying, as opposed to a culture where the radical shift is inherent as part of growing and living.
I would say that the indigenous culture they don't look at it as a radical shift. They're comfortable living in two different realities and going back and forth. They're as comfortable as, we are living predominantly in one reality. They have that comfort level in the two realities. And, there's some evidence that the Eleusinian mysteries and the Greeks, that they would take the young people as part of their ritual of becoming adults. They were given a brew that contained mushrooms, and to be able to be comfortable with this other reality, starting fairly early in your life, that it becomes not such a big deal, and you're taking them within a community of people who share that consensus ability to go back and forth between the two realities, that each, just as you get a lot of wisdom when you're a child from your elders, you also get wisdom from the plants and from the animals. It's just it's an expanded reality, maybe not two different realities. It's all part of one expanded reality. Maybe we can think of it that way.
It has to have something to do, though, with the integration of humans into nature, though, right? Because, okay, so let's say you live in New York City and you decide to get attuned to the animals. It's horrifying. You get attuned to the New York City pigeons and they all have weird tumors and they're missing legs and
Pizza rats,
and it's just the animal world that you attune to in these urban places is not an animal world that is very reassuring or comforting. It seems to, there are alarm bells.
Even in Oregon where we're at, there's no animals left anymore. It's weird.
Like it's really creepy. We go into the woods and it's empty. There's not really birds. There's not deer. There's not, the rivers are pretty empty.
Not that much fish left anymore.
Yeah, there's not really fish. There's not really beavers. Yep. And so you wander around this landscape. Like, I used to give backpacking tours and I would take people up Mount Adams. I would take people up Mount St. Helens. I would take people for 4 days on the PCT. I saw in all my time of guiding, one deer. And these are backcountry trails where you're out of cell reception. You're on, actually a lot of them were on tribal lands, and even there where there's a concerted effort to regenerate the landscape, it still feels like it's almost like you're wandering through a model home, where like the trees are there, the plants are there, the huckleberries are growing, there's ferns, it's pretty. But where are the inhabitants?
Well, I'll tell you, here in Tucson, we live very close to the Santa Cruz, quote, river. And most of the time it's a dry riverbed. It comes up from Mexico. It's quite a long distance. And maybe 6, 8, 10, I'm not even sure when they started. The county, water in the Southwest is a critical issue, and the aquifers are drying up. So the county has built a number of water reclamation plants, and one of them, I think 2 of them, are built near enough to this dry riverbed so that half of the reclaimed water goes back to industry, but the other half is pumped, not pumped, it's allowed to go into the riverbed. And they began it by carving a channel so that it wouldn't just spread over the whole riverbed and evaporate and you'd lost it from the beginning. So when the river from this reclaimed water was guided into a fairly narrow channel, maybe 6 or 8 feet wide, what happened was, not surprisingly in retrospect, all these dried seeds that were there, green came up on both sides of it, and waterfowl came back, birds came back, coyotes are seen in there, even occasional bobcat, javelinas. So they're ready. They're ready to come back. It's really wonderful to see, and it's a place where I walk every morning, and so over the years, we spend half the time. I forgot you guys were also in Oregon, so we spend half our time in Portland and half the time in Tucson, and it's been wonderful just to see that slow reemergence of of all that life.
Yeah, there's a feeling that I have where we have a sense right now of, the pending disaster for the earth, but there's also plenty of evidence to suggest that if we just stopped inflicting the damage, that there's enough biomass and there's enough biological history that it could regrow and it could come back, and that nature is not at risk of permanent extinction. What is it at risk is it's at risk of
alienation.
And it's weird too, because all of these things were done to nature because at the time they seemed like the right thing to do. You have animals that attack livestock, you have animals that carry disease, you have all of these reasons to push nature away as far as you can and to create the safe barrier. But what we've done is we've created these spaceship bubbles in which we live, where we're not subject to the natural turns of the environment. And so when the environment starts to turn in a way that threatens us, where it threatens our systems of how we grow food, of how we get food to our stores, then we start to panic without realizing that the best way to deal with it is to seek resilience in the face of the change that's coming.
Sure. I think when you said it's the right thing to do, the problem is we've conflated, we have the right to do it with it being the right thing to do. And those are two very different things. There was an old New Yorker cartoon I've always remembered. There's a lot of cartoons where the seeker is crawling up the side of a mountain and the guru is sitting on the mountain. And this is one of those cartoons. And the seeker is just about to get to the guru and start asking him, what's the secret of life and everything like that, when a jet plane goes over the mountain, and the guru looks up and says, yes, he says, let me get it right. He says, they have the know-how, but they don't have the know-why. And that's it. We're so out of balance between know-how and know-why that we conflate the right thing to do with the right to do it. And they're very different things. We decided we have the right to use nature and to use it for our purposes without understanding the unintended consequences.
But where else could all the know why live but inside of some shared mythology? It seems like that's what's being primed in these ceremonies is the shared mythology that, like, if you look at our mythology wherever it lives, maybe in Netflix or something, it's kind of a it's kind of an apocalyptic cosmology, right? All of these futuristic movies end in dystopia and things burning down. And this is, if there's a shared vision, this is kind of what we have. And the question is, can we change that?
Well, let's talk a little about the Biofields. Because hopefully getting back to appreciate what it is that connects us, and how we can use this, and how we can maybe even do research that reminds us that there is this, some people call it consciousness, some people call it biofield, Zen probably calls it suchness. But what is it that we've lost that that does connect us? And I guess we started by talking a little bit about my and your shared Shiloh sort of Western medicine and Western physiology roots, and how do we sort of get back to realizing that there's, how shall I say it, that there's a lot of physiology that's happened 24/7 that's not biochemistry.
Mm.
That's certainly that's electromagnetic processes in our body, that's tiny amounts of light, which we call biophotons, light that's generated from biological reactions. There's sound that's happening in our body. There are all different kinds of, as I said, 24/7 physiological regulatory mechanisms that's not biochemistry. And that's going to lead us to saying, well, as a bookmark, we're going to call all of these non-biochemistry parts of ourselves biofields.
Mm.
And I'm going to want to say that these are little b biofields because they're all separate physiological mechanisms. There's that word again.
Yeah.
But we can describe and we can begin to study them separately. And maybe there's a way in which they merge into a big B biofield. I don't know yet. But the link between people and maybe between that big B biofield and the little b biofields are what we call biofield therapies. So this term, which may be a good term or maybe just a temporary term, a placeholder until we understand a more holistic way of thinking of what our physiology is. When NIH was first required by Congress in the early 90s to start looking at all of these other healthcare interventions that people were using, that these early surveys in the 90s were showing that people were using and spending out of pocket to take advantage of. NIH finally said to Congress finally called when there was, I can't remember what her name was, a woman was the head of the NIH at that time, and she came to the Senate Appropriations Committee, and Tom Harkin from Iowa was the head of the Senate Appropriations Committee, and Senator Harkin had a very bad I can't even remember what kind of allergies, and he had gone on a personal quest to try to find out what could help him. And after exhausting various Western approaches, he started looking into non-Western approaches. And I believe it was bee venom that really started to help him. But in the course of that, he started learning about Reiki and all many other types of therapies that were not accepted within mainstream biomedicine. And so when it came time for the Senate Appropriations Committee, Harkin said to her, of course we consider NIH like mom and pop and apple pie, and we're definitely going to give you the increase that you're asking for. This would have been maybe 1990, 91. But he said to her, but what about all of these other things that I'm finding out that people are using? And a recent survey has shown, this was the Eisenberg's first survey, that people are using and paying out of pocket. And the mythos of that interaction, and I've never seen a transcript of it or heard anything, but the mythos is that she said, excuse me, at NIH, we only study real medicine. And he said, he is alleged to have said, excuse me, the purpose of NIH is to study what people are using and to protect them and make sure that what they're using is sound, evidence-based. The term probably wasn't used in the early 90s quite yet, to the extent it is now, but to make sure that they're based in solid evidence. And he started saying, and she didn't get where he was coming from. Anyway, the upshot of that was that Harkin worked with several people in the House to have a joint bill, and they mandated the NIH to start what then was a small office. It was called the Office of Alternative Medicine. And an office is something that works out of the director. It has a tiny, tiny budget. And at that point, there were two other offices. There was an Office of Women's Health. That's all the credence it was given then. And there was an Office of Orphan Diseases, and this became the third one. So even with their tiny amount of money, they started collecting data on what people were using, and they were able to fund by doing joint efforts with established institutes at NIH to fund a little bit of research. And they also funded very small pilot studies of a whole range of non-biomedical interventions, of healthcare approaches. They were given, I think the grants were $40,000 for 1 year. And anyone who's done any research, that sounds like a lot of money. It's nothing when you have to pay the practitioners, and when you have to take the time to design the research, and you have to have it approved by an ethics committee, by an IRB, to do the research. In any case, they were able to do enough good work that in maybe 6 or 7 years, Harkin got Congress to mandate that NIH should move that office up to a center. So that we talked about, that Dr. Langevin is now the director of that center. So that's the next level of entity at NIH. So it was originally called NCAM, the National Center for Alternative and Complementary Medicine, and now the term alternative has gone out of favor, and the term medicine has been changed for this entity to health. So it's now called NCCIH, the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health. That was one of the last things that Tom Harkin did before he retired, was get the name changed after it became a center. So he got the name changed from alternative to integrative, and from medicine to health, because what's really important here is so much of NIH, the people like to say it's not a National Institutes of Health, it's a National Institutes of Diseases. And because it focuses on diseases and not so much on health, we say it's going from -5 to 0. In other words, the absence of disease is considered health. Well, now we know that we want to go from 0 to +5, and that's in large part the focus on so many of these complementary and integrative approaches to health that's now the covered. That's the mandate of this center at NIH. So we're happy to say that they now have their own budget, and they are able to fund not only clinical trials, but also studies that look for correlations, what they call biomarkers, and they want to get to the point where they can start funding mechanism studies that are really mechanisms that understand what the fascia is all about, and that understand how acupuncture actually does work. So when we start with something like acupuncture or any other discipline, the two big questions are, does it work? And then how does it work? So those are the two questions. So in the early days, especially when the old Office of Alternative Medicine was giving out these $50,000 grants, they got huge numbers of applications, and they had to figure out how to bin them. What were the bins to put them in? Which were more physical medicine, which was plant-based medicine, which were perhaps energy-based medicine. And one of the groups was charged with how do we redefine so-called energy medicine that's more acceptable in a biomedical context. And the head of that group was a biophysicist named Beverly Rubik, who's done wonderful work in a lot of these integrative health areas. And she came up with the term biofield that was acceptable, and also biofield therapies. And they wrote a big report introducing these terms. And at that point, they were also able to get these terms accepted in the National Library of Medicine. And that's the entity that determines what the so-called mesh terms, the medical indexing terms are. So when you search PubMed, you can now use biofield as a search term, or biofield therapies as a search term. So those were major advances. So what do we mean by biofield? And I think as we look at the landscape, there's quickly three different ways that this term is being used. One are these, what I call little b biofields. And to give it a bigger, broader scope, I refer to it as biofield physiology. And biofield physiology are all of these processes that I said 24/7 are part of physiological regulation. So that's one way. Then there are the biofield therapies. So Reiki, therapeutic touch, healing touch, that both therapeutic touch and healing touch were developed by the nursing profession in large part, and these come out of the old tradition of laying on of hands. But many of what are used now in the West, like Reiki and external Qigong, come out of very different traditions. But these are all together are a family, are called biofield therapies. And one unique thing about virtually all of these biofield therapies is in clinical practice, they are effective with either light touch or non-physical touch. So once we get to non-physical touch, the question is, okay, you can find clinical effectiveness when you're 3 inches or 1 foot or maybe even across the room. But now we're also finding with some studies, not all of them have been shown to be effective, but in clinical practice, most practitioners in many of these biofield therapies will tell you distance is not a problem. So I can heal somebody in the next county, in the next state, who knows how far away we can really are effective. So a biofield therapy, one thing that's in common with all of these is they have been shown, at least in some research studies and certainly in clinical practice, to produce clinical effectiveness with light touch, as with proximal healing. And proximal means you're close to the body, but you're away from it, and also what we call distance healing. And there's some question of whether this near the body healing is acting in the same manner as this distance healing. We don't know that yet, but looked at this way, we're starting to get a handle on what biofield means, and perhaps what's between a biofield master and the client when they are using non-physical touch that well, from a Western point of view, we would say something is being generated in the palms or the hands of a Reiki master, and some energy is therefore going from the palms to the body of their client. So that's a very Western-oriented way of trying to get at the mechanism. Something is going from A to B, and there's a specific receptor in the body, and then there are, if that's the case, however, it wouldn't necessarily explain how you can get clinical benefit at further and further distances, because in classical physics, there's something called the inverse square law. So if it's an electromagnetic effect, for example, it should be less and less effective the further away you are from your client. And that doesn't seem to be the case.
Well,
Moreover,
hold on one second. There's a couple things here. Go ahead.
okay.
Well, I just want to
jump in anytime, because I'll just keep talking here.
That's all good. I just have a very real experience with this as a musician performing. Like, I can tell you for sure that having, or as a lecturer, I taught like a pretty large lecture hall this last semester at the university. There's a very real focusing element to having 150, 1,000 people staring at you on a stage. It's very real. And so I haven't thought about that in any terms of biofields or anything, but I do think that people having that attention on them does something physiologically to them. We're aware of that, and we change our physiology as a result of it. And so I don't think it has to be as spooky as maybe it sounds on its face. What were you going to say?
Well, I mean, to add to that, I think that the psychological effects of having someone care for you can't be overstated. Where, there's you hear people that are going through some kind of mental health crisis, and the difference in intervention where they have someone in the room with them who's a real person who's talking to them versus a chat program on a screen are very apparent. Because what people seem to need in that moment is they need the attention of a human being that is caring for them. And the care is the focusing of the attention in a similar, perhaps less massive, but similar way than if you have 150 or 1,000 people staring at you while you're doing a performance.
And there's feedback too, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you can be in a room. God,
right.
we've played shows with hostile crowds, and that's a very different experience than playing a show with a crowd that really enjoys it. And so it's the same music, it's the exact same performance, but the experience of it is completely different, regenerative versus horrifying.
I'm sure it sounds different too.
I'm sure it does. But what I was going to say is, like, okay, from a purely statistical standpoint, there is such a thing as regression to the mean, right? And so if you have somebody who has a transient condition and they go see a practitioner and they get care, and the care is at a distance and they get better, how can you really clearly tease apart if it is the intervention that is causative or correlative?
Yeah. And you can also say, to what extent does it matter to really understand this mechanism? There's a lot of people who will say to me when I get off on this, when I teach the acupuncture college, there's always a percentage of the students who don't care about this stuff. They just know it works. And as we said earlier in our talk, Chinese medicine recognizes something called EYI, this intention, as part of the treatment. And almost all of the acupuncture colleges in this country are a model that the Maoists created, which is called traditional Chinese medicine, or TCM. But there's also a small number of colleges that teach what's called the 5 elements approach, and this was developed by in England, actually, and it was influenced by the French, who were very interested in a kind of more energetic medicine. And in the 5 element schools, they focus a lot on developing rapport. As Shiloh was saying before, that intention is a kind of one-way thing, but developing rapport is two-way, and it's palpable. It's palpable. The practitioner can sense when it's right, and you as a patient or a client want to have that rapport with your practitioner. When you're choosing someone who you work with, you want someone who not just has a good reputation, but is going to work well with you. And this is all going to be understood one day when we have these intentionometers and when we can really validate compassion as separate from intention. And these are all aspects of what gets lumped into placebo, but really need to be teased out. So what you said before, the regression to the mean, or people often tend to go for treatment when the pain is worse. And so there's just a natural rise and fall in your condition. And so maybe you went when the pain was worse. And so the following week, it was just naturally had ebbed. Or another example is why it's so important to find out something about your client or your patient, because suddenly they started getting better and you think it was your treatment, and you find out they just fell in love. Well, who knows what that mix of hormones is going to be doing to your physiology and your ability to where your pain set point is. So that there are all of these other, it's sort of why, in a way, so-called anecdotes get poo-pooed, but in Western medicine, and if you like what happens with your particular patient, you call it a case report and you write it up. If you don't like what happens, you don't believe it, it's called an anecdote. But it's really the same thing. And the value of these individual responses, individualized responses, is then you try to see, suppose I have a couple of other patients who respond in the same way, then it's not so off the wall. And then maybe I can set up a study where the next 6 patients come in to my office, and I can remember they have this similarity, and I'm going to treat them in this different way. So it starts not to become an anecdote or an N of 1 anymore. And then that could, so the value that one of the directors of this center at NIH used to love to say, and it wasn't necessarily unique to him, but he used to love to say the plural of anecdotes is not data. And it's a way of really dismissing what's really important in these individual responses from a patient, because the value of anecdotes is they generate hypotheses for research. And then you can test them with gradually increasing sample size and increasing rigor. And I think you started by talking about, we got onto this whole thing about, you were asking about regression to the mean. And it really is that there are parts of placebo that shouldn't be within placebo. Placebo has a very different meaning, and the regression to the mean or the wax and waning of the condition are not part of what's placebo. As placebo gets lumped as everything else but what the drug does or what the particular intervention does.
I think that it's also about the types of intervention that can be studied this way, because if you look at something like cancer, you cannot give someone less than the standard therapy for cancer and then test something else on top of it. It's not like you can look to see if Reiki therapy in isolation can cure cancer, because that would be an unethical trial design.
Yes.
You would have to enroll people, give everyone the standard care, and then on top of that be comparing Reiki versus no Reiki, or Reiki versus sham, right?
Right, but that's a valid study design of doing that, treatment plus Reiki. And in fact, Reiki and other biofield therapies have been studied as preoperative. What happens if I give Reiki pre-op and we find that the patients bleed, there's less perioperative bleeding, and there's less time in the recovery. Post-op time decreases. There's even been some study, and I'm not sure which of the biofield therapies, of being used in helicopters when they're medically bringing a person, onto the roof of a trauma center. In fact, I think the study I'm thinking of was not a biofield therapy, was using acupuncture for anxiety. Just relieving that anxiety gives you better results when the patient is traumatized before they are actually as they're being brought to the trauma center. So there are ways of this is what complementary medicine means. How can we use these in addition to it? And that's a very valuable approach. Just as another research design, which is really important these days, instead of comparing Reiki to sham Reiki, you compare Reiki to what is the standard of care for that particular condition. This is called comparative effectiveness research. And that's clinically so much more important, because then you can compare which treatment begins to work sooner, which treatment lasts longer, which treatment is more cost effective. All these kinds of questions you can't answer if you're comparing a treatment to a sham treatment.
Do you know Wim Hof at all?
I know one person who swears by Wim Hof, and I don't know enough about it to talk about it.
Well, but I mean, I think that it's something that might be really interesting for you, because Wim Hof he's made his name off of cold therapies and cold plunges and doing these strongman feats of, swimming underneath Arctic ice and holding the world record for breath holds underwater. And something that's really interesting is that there's actually been a group that studied his physiology. And they did this incredible experiment where they injected him with LPS and watched LPS, lipopolysaccharide. It's the bacterial envelope protein that activates the non-specific immune inflammatory response.
Makes you inflamed.
Yep.
And so it's not necessarily dangerous, but it causes an inflammatory cascade.
Sure, I just didn't know the acronym. Yep.
Yeah, of course. And so he is able, with his breathing exercises and this meditative practice, to stop his inflammatory response, which would be crazy. So they can measure it in the laboratory, and he can teach volunteers to do the same thing.
Yep.
And on top of that, he's also able, they did another experiment where through his breathing techniques, they put him in this cold suit where they were able to measure his surface skin temperature and his core body temperature, but the suit was filled, it ran cold water over his skin. And using his same breathing technique, he was able to maintain surface body temperature even after, I think it's 45 minutes in this cold suit.
And even better, he has a twin brother who doesn't do this technique.
And
Come
so
on.
he's...
That's amazing. Yeah. And it's kind of ideal.
Oh.
Yeah, we spoke to one of the scientists that was working on some MRI studies of this
a
guy.
while ago.
But he's quite a specimen for the empiricists, particularly with the immune connection. It's just mind-bending, really.
But I think that what this speaks to is that there is a history of meditative practice around the breath and around the way that the body responds to those sorts of changes, where I can imagine that if you're in a helicopter and you're injured and you're getting airlifted somewhere and there's someone in the helicopter with you who is going through a ritualistic practice that is helping you relieve the anxiety, that you're going to do better than if every single one of your systems is just firing like fireworks.
Yes.
I didn't really have anywhere to go with that. I just wanted to let you know.
I mean, one thing that...
Yeah.
I mean, one thing you probably do know something of is Michael Levin's work with the...
Definitely.
Especially when it comes to the intentionality. We've had him on the show once, and he's coming back next month. And one of my favorite parts of his work is that he talks about, at a cellular level, this concept of intentionality. That perhaps the way to think about regenerative medicine and cancer is trying to understand what the cells want, which is really interesting. And I think that broadens up to what the patient needs and what this word health embodies that medicine doesn't.
I mean, if we're talking to plants and finding out what the plants want and the plants conduct, why can't we talk about the cells? I'm just blocking on the name in South India of the ashram there that was founded by, help me out here.
This one I don't know.
She was called the Mother, and he is. Anyway, they had.
I know what you're talking about too. I can't think of the name. I was just reading about this.
Is it Sri Aurobindo?
Yes, Aurobindo. Yes. So he and the Mother have experimented on themselves and written extensively about helping your cells evolve and really changing your cellular composition and tuning in to be able to do that. And Herbert Benson went to Tibet, and studied these monks who were able to up in the mountain and put in the freezing cold and wrapping themselves in a sheet and changing their core temperature to not just survive but to dry out the sheet. So it's just what the possibilities are of us as humans is just barely tapped, and we've just forgotten so much of the indigenous knowledge in so many parts of the world where they knew how to do this. I came across a wonderful word recently, if you don't know it already, and the word is indigenuity, which means indigenous ingenuity. They put them together. It's really quite lovely. I don't think I can find it quickly for you.
Oops, we've lost the camera.
Yeah, I know. I was looking for it. Anyway, it's part of indigenuity is part of a larger acronym. And the acronym was EDIDI, and the last I was indigenuity, and E is equity and decolonization. It's pulling together all of the social justice terms into one acronym. But the last one was this indigenuity, which I thought was such a wonderful term. So it's not just a rush to the Amazon by the pharmaceutical companies to find all of this local knowledge that they can make money from. It's a way of being. It's other ways of seeing. It's how do we tap into these alternative realities, and how do we control our physiology? How do we get in touch with who we are and what we really can do and make of ourselves? It's wonderful to contemplate.
I love that. That might be a good place to wrap. We're almost at 3 hours.
Whoa.
I mean, it's been really illuminating, because I think that these are topics that we spend a lot of time thinking about in terms of our own lives, because it's obvious that there is something that is beyond the bullet target mechanism of modern medicine, where if you have a problem, you go get a pill, and there's some kind of molecule that's inside that pill that's going to cure you.
Of course.
Right, but that's a hard thing to really wrap your head around, because we live in a world where that's the evidence-based consensus, is that you go into a pharmaceutical context in order to be cured.
It's easy and lazy too, right? Like, it's so much easier for me to take a Tylenol than to do a breathing exercise. At one level of effort, like at an effort-based level, right?
Yeah,
it's so much easier for me to take a fat pill than to exercise, or a muscle-building pill. Like, this is the dream of the technological West, is to make it as easy as possible to be healthy, right? And so a culture that embraces the difficult seems like it would lend itself towards these ideas a lot better than one that's aimed towards comfort and ease.
Yeah, because this seems fundamentally resistant to the pill form. This fundamentally seems to be a practice of human-human interaction, where at the base there is the practitioner who is focused on you and has an intention that is centered on helping you in a way that when you go to a doctor's office now, they have 10, 15 minutes to deal with you. Like my mom has really, really bad migraines. And she's always amazed that no doctor has ever touched her.
Yep.
And that's just that's the crux of the biscuit, so to speak.
Well, you're not allowed. It's illegal. It's you'll lose your license.
And so we live in a time where medicine is divorced from physical contact, and yet you know that people are desperate for physical contact because we live in a world where the illegality of that is uniform. Like we used to work as substitute teachers in the school system, and you had to do this training, and they basically told you, if you touch a child, you will get fired. And I understand why.
Like even if they're like beating each other up or whatever.
Yeah, like under no circumstances are you
can
allowed
hit them with a ruler, but not with your hand.
I wouldn't test drive that.
Yeah, that starts a whole nother cascade.
Oh, yes.
But it's just like and that's a standard training for all teachers. And I understand why, because power dynamics and people are weird and there's creeps everywhere and you have to keep kids safe. But on the other hand, we used to live in these communities where physical touch was more prevalent. Like even among friends now, there was a point where I was like, I need to touch my friends more as hugs and as gestures, because otherwise it's not, you don't get the same kind of connection. And I grew up, when I was a kid, my mom would always hold my hand. And even as I was an adult and as a teenager, I would, I'd go walking with my mom and we'd hold hands. And I realized that this is something that I only do with my family. And so now when I'm like, in the back seat of the car with my brother, we're both adults, but there's this moment where we'll hold hands, and it is
wonderful.
It's a touch that can't be replaced with anything. And I think it's gone from the world. And this sort of research might be the best, closest way that we can come to it in a way that more people can understand and grasp it. And so I really value the work that you're doing.
Yeah. And with COVID, I'm starting to see a few trials of Reiki and of a whole nother thing we could get into, but the use of tuning forks to detect and treat imbalances, but over Zoom.
Whoa.
And and with the tuning fork study, the group that I'm working with, the Consciousness and Healing Initiative, have finished just a study with no control group, just proof of concept study, and showing that what they do is they maintain the video link to establish the rapport, and then they turn off the video while they're doing the actual tuning fork. So the tuning fork, this is if you know if you've seen a woman named Eileen McCusick, is that a? So she's the one who's done most of the research that I know of, and she's fascinating to talk to. And she has a book out called maybe Tuning the Human Body. Anyway, she explains the use of the tuning forks, they believe, which is something that is, again, extremely radical in terms of the accepted biomedical model, that there is a history of illness and disease, that they comb the biofield, or whatever they comb the field, which is outside of the physical body. And not only do they detect, they Well, she's from Vermont, and so she activates the tuning fork on a hockey puck. So, but you activate the tuning fork, and then you, by listening to the sound or feeling how you respond, you can detect where there's a glitch in the sound. And that distance not only tells you what kind of emotional or physical problem there was, but here's the amazing thing. The edge of the field is your current age. So they estimate, and they've just been doing this over and over and collecting the data. I don't like to say they claim, because that's kind of has a negative connotation. They report that they can tell if this happened when you were a teenager or it happened in your late 30s. They can't tell you, you were 20 years old in 6 months, but they can really tell when it happened to you, not only what it is. And so not only do they do this up close and personal for a client, but they now have successfully done this over Zoom, and they're gearing up now to do a larger study in this comparative effectiveness mode. I think they're going to compare it to CBT, behavioral therapy.
I mean, this stuff is so interesting, and we could talk to you all day. But I think that we should put a pin in it here and just have you back in another couple of months. I'm sure that there's so much here that we have to digest and get ready to talk about.
Well, I'm delighted that the first time I ever met Mike Levin was we had an initial meeting of the Consciousness and Healing Initiative, really to get people together. And he came to that meeting, and then he turned out to, and that meeting, you may have come across it. It led to about a dozen white papers that we were able to publish as a supplement in a journal, in one journal. So they were all together, and he was part of the paper that I know Shiloh saw, of the Biofield physiology paper. He was on that paper that I was first author on. But he backed away. I mean, he really believes, and more power to him, he wants to get his research accepted in the top biology journals, the cell biology journals, and the biomedical journals, and he doesn't want to be associated with terms like biofield. I mean, I'm glad you got to talking about it. At that point, he wouldn't want to talk about intentionality at the cellular level. So there's another part to Mike Levin that you're able to draw out that I'm delighted.
But we got to him in that way by examining the definition of life. And the best thing we could come up with was something that exhibits intentionality. And so, yeah, it was kind of a roundabout. He wrote a little-known philosophical paper about life, and he's got some cool philosophical writings that are on the edge of what people are aware of that I recommend.
I mean, he is so prolific. It's just amazing. Yeah, so prolific. And he's getting more and more away from just, what does the change in resting potential mean in terms of regeneration or development. He's really getting out to see where the ripples are of his original studies.
The thing I love about this, and the thing I love about what you're doing, is you're looking at something like medicine, which is typically this ball and socket mentality, but you're expanding it to the concept of health, which now brings in the entire society and your psychology and your spiritual life and everything. Yes. And it broadens it so that we're almost able to examine something scientifically which doesn't really even belong in science in a sense, but we can't avoid it because we're talking about our health, which is something we want to have an understanding of, a rational understanding of. And so it's an amazing crossroads of the spiritual and the physical.
Yeah, I mean, we're paying the price, and we're still trying to get out from under when the physical got separated from the spiritual. When they said, okay, the church, you've got our spirit, and science can have the physical, and we've got to get them back together because it's so important for our health.
especially as people have become dissatisfied with the church in the West and have moved away from that, they can't. They're really hungry for spiritual health too. At the same time, all of our characteristic choke points in the West seem to come down to spiritual malaise and lack of meaning. And so, I think it's really, really
Amen.
powerful, important stuff.
Amen.
Yeah.
Okay, so you'll let me know when you're going to schedule this?
Yes.
Yeah, sure.
It'll probably in the next 2 weeks.
Next 2 weeks, so that's soon. Okay, because I'll get a lot more people onto your website just by spreading the word among the people I know.
Fantastic.
Awesome. Yeah, that's how we reach almost everyone. So we haven't hit the algorithmic sweet spot. We're not extreme enough in any particular domain that they don't know which radicalized people to feed us to. So
there's a guy who does a similar thing, but just for acupuncture. He tries to get all the people who are interested on the fringe of acupuncture. Can't remember. I did a couple of programs with him. Pre-COVID, so it's been a while now. He's based in St. Louis. I can't remember his.
If you think of it, if you think of it, send us an email. We could talk to him. That'd be cool. I like talking to people that have studied wide. They always have interesting wisdom.
Yep.
Anyways, Richard, it's been
I'm doing all this now in my quote retirement. So I don't have the constraints that I used to have I'm not grant funded or anything like that. I can just jump in and out and see the different strands of the web that has no weaver.
Yeah, I love that. I love that phrase too.
Yeah, that's a good phrase.
That plays into so much. In terms of physics and cosmology too. This web idea is becoming increasingly prevalent in the way we're starting to think about the physical world too. So. Anyways, it's been really fun.
Do you guys get up to Portland at all?
We were just there.
Yeah.
You were just there. Okay.
Yeah, we should hang out.
We're in Portland. We'll be leaving here. So we're in the summer, the whole summer and end of spring and beginning most of fall, and then we go back and forth.
It's really nice up there in the summer.
So,
yeah. Send us a note when you go, and it's not that far of a drive. It's like 4 hours from where we are, and so maybe we can make it up there the same time that you are. It'd be great to see you in person.
Okay, a pleasure.
All right. Thank you so much.
Have a
Very
great night,
enjoyable.
Richard.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.